each officer. He was an officer. He was with Officer Sabalik, and they both were behind Officer Brelo. They got out of their vehicle. Officer Sabalik was a probationary officer. I think Farley fired 4 times, Sabalik fired 4 times.
Okay. What about Officer Patrick and Box?
I don't recall those.
I'm sorry, what about Officer Randy Patrick? Do you know if he fired his weapon?
I did, but I didn't focus on it because I was looking to find if it was reasonable or not, and obviously my opinion is that the officers that were at the scene acted reasonably.
Right. Do you know where Officer Patrick was located back here?
No, sir, I don't recall at this time. I did at one time, but because I had found that all the officers were acting reasonably, I more or less dismissed that from my mind after I had focused on them and focused on the actions then of Officer Brelo.
How about Officer Eric? Did you see him behind the car over here where I'm pointing?
No, I do not recall the specifics of each of the officers. I indicated they acted reasonably.
Do you know if he was in a uniform?
Some weren't, and I don't recall. But it doesn't matter to me at this point because I had already dismissed in my mind that the actions of each of those officers were reasonable under the circumstances.
I got that. I'm just trying to go through the facts as to where these officers were and looking at their individual use of force with you.
It was not relevant to my ultimate conclusion that I came to about the actions of Officer Brelo.
Well, weren't you engaged to give an opinion on whether all the officers who used deadly force were within the bounds of the law and used, as you put it, objectively reasonable force?
I did. I rendered that opinion.
So you don't remember who you gave an opinion about?
I don't specifically at this time recall the actions of each of 13 officers except for the fact that I focused on the officer that I believed was not objectively reasonable given the circumstances.
The guy who stood up, the guy who fired the most shots, and the guy that was on the hood of Malibu, and the guy that was on the trunk of 238, right?
He was.
Okay. All right, if we can turn to page 6 of your report, paragraph 5. That's another one of your opinions, correct?
Yes, that's
and
correct.
In that opinion, you indicate that the specific actions of the driver and the passenger in the fleeing, speeding suspect vehicle were carefully and painstakingly assembled by the Ohio Attorney General's office, correct?
Correct, sir.
You indicated, let me withdraw that. Again, that would cover page 6. And would it be a fair statement that other than referencing the deadly threat and the deadly force used by the suspects in the suspect vehicle, that there's nothing thus far referring to Officer Brelo or his use of force in your report?
That's correct.
And there's nothing thus far relative to the use of deadly force by the other officers, correct?
That's correct.
So if we turn to page 7, you indicated what the investigators did, right? They gathered evidence. They prepared a lengthy, well-documented, and visually recreated investigation, and they left no stone unturned, correct?
Yes.
And they did so to arrive at an accurate assessment of the actions and interactions of numerous officers and the fleeing suspects, correct?
Correct.
You continue at the top of page 7, like my own analysis, and let me ask you.
Where are you, sir?
I'm on the top of page 7.
Where? How many? I see. Throw fourth line down. Okay.
Like, you see that? Like
Yes.
my own analysis?
Yes.
See that? Is it your testimony that the preceding 6 pages is analysis? The preceding 6 pages that we've covered, would you characterize those 6 pages as analysis?
Not all of it was analysis. Some of it's about me.
But it continues here. Like my own analysis, the thrust was reviewing, documenting, and recreating the use of deadly force. Deadly force perceived reasonably to be used or prepared to be used by the occupants of the fleeing vehicle and that of the police officers attempting to neutralize the threats and potential threats of the vehicle occupants. Was that your opinion?
Yeah. Well, it's not. It's a statement. It's a statement that I did analyze the thrust of those officers and the suspects.
I thought your testimony was that these these numbered paragraphs are your opinion, because on page 3, it has report and opinions that you provide based on reasonable certainty in the area of law enforcement policies, and then you enumerate them.
Yes.
Based upon this assessment, is my opinion that goes 1,
Right.
2, 3, 4, 5, and now we're on 5. So I'm saying, what I'm asking you is, what I just read you, is that another one of your opinions?
Well, I don't think everything in here is an opinion. This is a statement. I'm indicating, like my own analysis, the thrust was reviewing, documenting, recreating the use of deadly force. I was talking about the state and their review. I said, like my own analysis, I was talking about what they had done because I reviewed their material and I was commenting on their review.
All right. And again, this sentence that we just covered, you again reaffirmed that the suspects in the Malibu were using deadly force against the officers, right?
Reasonably perceived to be, yes.
Right. So my question, though, was, were the suspects using deadly force against the officers?
Reasonably perceived to be using deadly force.
I didn't ask you about perception. I asked you if the occupants of the suspect vehicle were using deadly force against those officers, as you said more.
At one point, only with the vehicle, in terms of the potential for striking and or hitting a patrol car or individuals that were close, in terms of the potential for that the vehicle would be considered deadly force. That is the deadly force they were actually potentially involved in, but they were not shooting.
Well, who are the officers that the suspects used deadly force against with their vehicle, or attempted to use deadly force with their vehicle?
Well, I don't recall at this time. However, I know that different officers had indicated that the car was coming towards them. They were out on foot and moving, and then obviously it struck vehicle number 238.
What about Officer Sistek? He was the passenger in 238. Recall that?
Yes.
And he was the one that, as he opened the door, the Malibu was coming to him, and he ran out of the way. Otherwise, he would have been run over and started shooting. Remember that? That
would have been deadly force at that time by the vehicle. That's correct.
No, not by the vehicle. The vehicle doesn't apply deadly force. Someone's got to be driving the vehicle, right? Was that vehicle?
In law enforcement, sir, we don't talk about what the person is doing when the vehicle is moving. We usually refer to what the vehicle was doing. Obviously, it's being driven by someone, but it's a reference to the vehicle. It's training in law enforcement to refer to the vehicle.
So then the officers who fired their weapons, they weren't using deadly force. Their weapons were using deadly force.
The officers made a decision to use deadly force. Certainly the person in the vehicle, the suspect's vehicle, was apparently attempting to use deadly force or inadvertently in an attempt to escape, were certainly threatening with deadly force with the vehicle.
Is it hard for you to acknowledge that the occupants of the suspect vehicle, in their effort to flee, attempted to use and did use deadly force against Officer Sistek? Is that hard for you to acknowledge?
It's not hard at all, sir, but you asked me...
Is it a fact that they did?
Let it answer. So the answer was it's not hard for you to acknowledge that. You had something else you wanted to say. But now, the next question is it a fact that they did or did not need that the occupant or an occupant of the vehicle did use deadly force with the car?
The application of the vehicle against an officer or his vehicle is deadly force.
Okay. And are you aware of the fact that the Malibu traveled down this driveway in other locations beyond just where you see it right now?
Yes.
Okay. And do you recall what that suspect vehicle did?
Not all of the particular actions, no.
Give us some to the best of your memory.
It went into the area, the area going into this parking lot.
Okay, which is what, up here, this driveway?
It came around the driveway, that's correct.
So what did that suspect vehicle do?
It was obviously attempting to flee and turned.
Okay, but the police were pursuing it, right?
Yes.
And it somehow wound up coming to this area where we see this nice model here. So is this a driveway?
Yes.
Okay. And do you know what geographically is located somewhere in this area of the driveway?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Is there some building that's located in this area?
I wasn't paying attention to the quality, quantity, or otherwise of the building. They were in the roadway. I was looking at the actions of the vehicle and the officers.
Was the fire department located over here where this driveway is coming down?
I believe I read something about that. It didn't seem to be very relevant.
The fire department? What about a grocery store? Was the grocery store located somewhere around here?
Judge, he's mocking the man.
I don't recall.
Objection to the comments, and again, Your Honor, he's not examining the witness.
He hasn't familiarized him with it. He's never...
Objection, he's trying to give him hints, Your Honor.
He wants to familiarize
himself. Why don't you just go up there and testify?
Why do you constantly object? Why do you constantly
get up
talk
there
over
and testify?
D'Angelo?
You're here.
Speech. That's
why every time I talk, he talks over me.
I've noticed that. But let's hold on, because the witness wasn't asked, I think, by either lawyer yet whether he's been to the scene. But the thrust of this questioning, I think, is fair. The basic thrust of this question is, what do you remember about the underlying facts in your review? Let's focus on that, though. I mean, we don't have to, like I said earlier, I'm not going to regulate matters of style, but let's get out what he knows and doesn't in a professional manner.
Your Honor, I asked him if he's going to use an exhibit, that he simply familiarize the witness with the exhibit.
Well, but the witness can say that. The witness can say, well, whatever is true. Hey, I've never seen this in life. I don't know if I don't know exactly what's there, or school, or whatnot. But his comments about, the questions about what buildings were there, they seem to me, at least, to bear in some fashion on the question of what danger was the car posing or not posing to the public as well as the officers. So the tone, though, should be, you don't have to be derisive toward the witnesses. You can be just as effective questioning them otherwise. Anyway, in all of this, the exact question has probably been lost, so I'm not going to sustain or overrule. I'll just ask you to either ask your next question or ask the same one in a different fashion.
I'm curious, Mr. Casares, do you have any idea whether there was a factory in this area, a school at the end of this driveway, a water treatment plant, a police department building, fire department building, or a stadium? Do you have any idea the location where this incident happened?
I recall something about a fire department there. I knew it was school property, and I don't recall whether it was a water treatment area. I do recall reading some of that material. I had not visited the scene. I had reviewed the materials, but I was most focused on the actions. It was late at night. I think but for the fire department, I don't believe there was anybody there.
I'm sorry. Continue.
Anyhow, I was focused on the actions of the vehicle.
Does your report state the materials that you reviewed prior to preparing your report?
I don't know that it does, no.
Okay. So I was just curious whether you really reviewed anything or you simply read Bogdanoff's report.
I read everything.
You read everything? So in that 1 month, you read everything? What was it that you read?
I read the entire BCI report. I was furnished discs with interviews and photographs. I was furnished transcripts of the officers that were there. I read the transcripts. I listened to the interviews. I read the entire BCI report.
Okay. you don't enumerate that, though, in your report in terms of materials that you reviewed, correct?
I don't believe that it is enumerated, no.
Okay. And you indicated that you viewed the video interviews of all the officers? There were a number of officers. I can't recall the numbers I reviewed, but I did. Give us a guess. How many videos of officer interviews did you actually look at in preparing this report in those 3 or 4 weeks?
I read all the transcripts. I believe that I listened to maybe 6 of them in their entirety. Otherwise, I believe that I relied on the transcripts of the others because I was not focusing on them after I had dismissed their involvement as being reasonable.
Was there anything notable from viewing any of the videos of any of these officers that you'd like to point out to us that you remember and you actually looked at prior to the preparation of your report in those 3 or 4 weeks?
I don't know that I know what you're asking me.
Well, is there anything that stood out in your mind from looking at any of the video interviews of any of the officers? In those 3 or 4 weeks,
I don't recall.
You say you looked at them prior to making your report.
I don't recall anything standing out, no.
Did you look at the video of Officer Brelo, this video interview?
Yes.
Do you remember anything that stands out in your mind about that interview?
Nothing that would shock me, no. I mean, he was upset. They kept telling him to calm down. It's over. I recall that, they were counseling him a little bit. He wanted to take a break. They took a break. I remember that.
Okay. Do you remember any officers showing any emotion?
I think there was emotions. I think emotion is not something I'm going to critique one way or the other because I learned a long time ago people grieve differently. Some can smile and laugh through it. Others cry. Some people just are bland. I wasn't paying attention to that. I'm not going to be moved by it one way or the other.
Well, I'll be direct with you, Mr. Casares. I'm looking to give you an opportunity to demonstrate to the court that in viewing those videos that you claim you viewed during those 3 or 4 weeks prior to preparing your report, how you can point to something definitive as evidencing the fact that you really did look at these videos.
Well, I just told you about Officer Brelo. Certainly I was focused on Officer Brelo. After I had been dismissed, I dismissed all of the others, considering what they knew, what they saw, what they believed, mistaken as it may have been. I simply didn't focus any further on them at that time.
Anything else that was notable about Officer Brelo?
I didn't find anything particularly notable other than he kept saying, in all the time I've been in Iraq, I never felt this frightened. They kept telling him, it's over now, it's okay, that kind of thing. I recall his demeanor. Yes, I do.
Okay. You've been a law enforcement officer for a long time, right?
Yes.
And you would know that if there's something distinctive about someone that you would be skilled and pick that out to evidence the fact that you either saw someone or you could identify someone with, let's say, some identifying characteristic.
Objection. Overruled.
I don't know, sir.
So I'm asking you, as the trained officer that you've talked about, skilled in testifying, was there anything that you noted about Officer Brelo that you observed or heard during those weeks that you say you were looking at the videos prior to making your report?
Objection. It's just been asked.
Well,
One last chance.
hold on. The objection is overruled.
No, I don't have anything that I can relate.
So I take it that if you had observed some sort of a speech impediment or that he speaks with a lisp, that would have been something very evident, and you could have enlightened us about that. But you haven't, right?
I would not have thought about that one way or the other, sir.
And it's not a fact that you just simply looked at Mr. Bogdanov's report, and in summary fashion, you may have looked at another report that was sent to the prosecutor from BCI. You read those, and then you made your report. You didn't look at all these officer statements, did you?
I did, sir.
Okay.
I have some of them with me. If you'd like to see that I read them, I've got them.
What I'd like to see is you point me out there.
He's attacking his integrity. He's calling him a thief. Let him pull out the things if he has some evidence that he has read these things. That the man is so dead, Your Honor.
Here's what we'll do. Again, this helps. This is something you can do in a bench trial. As the finder of fact, this issue is not the importance to me that it might be to you, so you might consider...
So I'll move on, Your Honor.
And if you want to redirect him, you can show his notes in the margins of the statements.
So we're on page 7, Mr. Casares.
Yes, sir.
In the middle of the page, you see the sentence, it's the ending of the pursuit and the final use of force.
We're at the end of page 7?
No, we're in the middle of the page on page 7.
The ending of the pursuit, yes, sir.
Okay, the ending of the pursuit and the final use of force was carefully and skillfully crafted into as accurate an animation of police vehicle location, suspect vehicle location, and individual officer actions. And it was determined that over 17.8 seconds, 13 officers discharged their weapons, correct?
Correct.
From the first dispatch of Officer Nan at 10:33 p.m., indicating he was shot at, until the request for EMS at 10:56, apparently 139 shots were fired by 13 officers, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then it continues on about the number of bullet holes in the car and some open areas of the car that these bullets may have traveled, correct?
Right.
And that takes us to the bottom of page 7.
Yes, sir.
Again, is there anything on page 7 or on the first 7 pages of your report that analyzes the use of force of Officer Brelo or any other Cleveland police officer?
I think it begins somewhat of an analysis because it starts talking about the numbers of shots fired.
Okay. Other than that, anything else?
No.
And now we're on page 8. It was determined that Russell sustained your opinion number 6.
Yes, sir.
It reads, the extraordinary number of shots fired and wounds sustained do speak volumes about the dynamic and protracted events of this November 29, 2012. At first blush, the thought of excessive and unnecessary force might come to mind, but any evaluation of an incident involving a police officer involved shooting must also review each reason for the shots fired, not the number of shots fired, correct?
Yes.
So in other words, the shock of 139 rounds being fired does not necessarily mean that there was excessive force used, correct?
That's right.
Your report continues, and also the number of officers at risk and fearing for his or her life or serious bodily injury must be considered in the number of shots fired as well. That's also your opinion?
Yes, sir.
So in other words, I take it by that you're saying that the number of officers who fired their weapons that large number of times should tell you something about their perception of the deadly threat they faced.
That's correct.
Your opinion continues, in fact, the sheer number of involved officers would tend to provide a framework of evaluation that would lead to better and more reliable results for determining the truth.
Yes.
Right? Conspiracies with the larger number of officers diminishes when the intensity of the examination of evidence and evaluation is completed, as this investigation was.
That's correct.
So are you saying there that you didn't see any kind of conspiracy or collusion among the officers in this case?
That's correct.
Paragraph 7 begins, because of the well-documented combined efforts of law enforcement, the Ohio Attorney General's Office, the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office, and an independent consultant's review by Philip Bogdanoff, this file is complete and I believe accurate. That was your finding?
Yes.
The next sentence, Mr. Bogdanoff's facts, and again, for the record, he was the one that engaged your services and recommended you to the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor, correct?
Yes.
So Mr. Bogdanoff's facts, which provide the basis for his analysis, are consistent with the entirety of the investigations and do provide the framework for not only his assessment, but mine as well.
Yes.
That was your opinion?
Yes, the framework.
The framework.
Yes.
Therefore, I am not going to repeat each officer action and perceptions as deadly force vis-a-vis firearm use by the 13 officers was imposed. I am of the opinion that all but one of the officers did in fact act reasonably when deciding the necessity for firing their weapon. Each of the officers' descriptions of the decisions and perceptions, even if mistaken, were reasoned based upon articulated movements, actions, or reasonable beliefs based upon other officer reasonable perceptions and observations. That was from the top of page 9, correct?
Yes, sir.
So would it be a fair statement that in paragraph 7, you're adopting the report of Mr. Bogdanoff?
Not in its entirety, because I transitioned, if you'll notice, on the previous page, but for one officer, Brelo, because we have, I think, a difference of opinion.
Do you state that anywhere in your report?
Yes.
Where? Where do you say that you disagree with Mr. Bogdanoff in his assessment of Officer Brelo?
It's where I say, therefore, I am not going to repeat each officer's actions and perceptions as deadly force vis-a-vis firearms use by the 13 officers that was imposed. I am of the opinion that all but one of the officers, that's where I transition away from, of course, the report of Mr. Bogdanoff, did in fact act reasonably when deciding the necessity for firing the weapon.
And that's what you're telling this court, you're saying with that language?
Yes, because I do recall we had a minor difference as it matters, Officer Brelo.
Go to the bottom of page 11 of your report. The second sentence, does it indicate that, but as I have already opined, the individual officers accepting Brelo did have a reasonable perception of the need for imposing deadly force, even if mistaken, as I believe the court case resolutions and the law clearly state, and is well and expertly presented by Mr. Bogdanoff's report.
That's correct.
So again, you're complimenting Mr. Bogdanoff and his report, correct?
With the exception.
What exception?
On the fourth line up, but as I have already opined, the individual officers accepting Brelo. I made the distinction.
Well, you also make a distinction in your report about Officer Brelo that he was justified in his use of force from the shots fired inside his car, 217.
That's correct.
And he was also justified in firing shots from behind 238, correct?
Correct.
If he stayed behind 238 and just kept firing the number of shots he fired, that would have been objectively reasonable, correct?
At that point, I would have had to have looked at what he did do. I don't have that to look at. I don't think we can presuppose that information, but generally speaking, I would say probably so.
Okay. So your opinion here today that his use of force was not objectively reasonable is premised on the fact that he was on the trunk of 238 and on the foot of the Malibu when he fired some of those shots, correct?
Also, in concert with all the other information that we know, there was a break in the shooting. Everything was quiet. I think 3 people indicated their movement had ceased, and there is, I think, 2 calls for ceasefire. One was before Brelo stepped onto the hood of the car, and then Officer Brelo is the only officer shooting at that time and fired some 15 rounds, possibly by audio experts. They say it could be maybe 3 other shots, but it sounded more, wasn't conclusive, that it may very well have been something of a retort back from the area.
Show me where that's noted in your report.
I didn't.
Other than information gotten from the prosecutor in conversation.
I noted that there was a break. I think that's in here.
Well, point it out to us.
I don't recall. Let me look. don't believe that I have it in there.
Okay. Let's just continue on page 8 at the bottom.
Okay?
So it's your testimony here in court today, under oath to Judge O'Donnell, that paragraph 7 indicates that you were differing with Mr. Bogdanoff on the assessment as it relates to Officer Brelo.
I said with the exception of Officer Brelo. That's correct.
You said that the use of force by all of the Cleveland police officers excepting Officer Brelo. That's different than saying that you have a disagreement with Mr. Bogdanoff.
I believe that it indicates that if you read it in its entirety instead of taking it out of context.
Okay. So
Number 7 refers to the fact that and an independent consultant's review by Philip Bogdanoff, this file is complete and I believe accurate. Mr. Bogdanoff's facts, which provide the basis for his analysis, are consistent with the entirety of the investigation and do provide the framework for not only his assessment but mine as well. Therefore, I am not going to repeat each officer's actions and perception as deadly force vis-a-vis firearms use by the 13 officers that was imposed. I am of the opinion that all but one of the officers did in fact act reasonably. Now, I'm not coming straight out and said I disagree with Mr. Bogdanoff, but it's obvious that Mr. Bogdanoff held a different opinion about Officer Brelo's actions, and I just didn't say right out that I disagree with him. I said all but the exception of Officer Brelo. I believe that that's pretty clear to me. It was my way of saying I disagree.
So you were being diplomatic? Is that what you're telling the judge?
I suppose so, yes.
Would you agree that other than the reference to Officer Brelo and the other 12 officers, in general terms, there's no specific analysis on the use of deadly force in your report on page 8?
Not a specific analysis of what, sir?
Of the use of deadly force and your opinions as to whether or not that deadly force was appropriate or not.
I said that it was with the exception of Brelo.
Right, but again, you're not getting into any specifics. You're speaking in general terms there, correct?
That's how I frame my report. That's correct.
Okay, so we've now covered 8 pages of your report, and the report speaks for itself, sir, but
sure. Again,
you would agree that there's no specific analysis that you provide thus far about officers' use of deadly force. And
I said that there wasn't a need to because Mr. Bogdanoff did cover it. I didn't disagree with him except with Officer Brelo.
Okay, let's turn to page 9 so we can move this along, sir. It's the very first sentence there, second line. As I indicated, to reassert each of these decisions at this time by me is not necessary because I totally concur with the perceived evaluations as related. What does that mean?
The evaluations, which of course were the perceived uses of force that the officers believed they needed to utilize, it was already investigated. The investigators did, as I already indicated, a good job of review. Mr. Bogdanoff reviewed and went over each of them. I went on to number 8 and talked about my thoughts on Officer Brelo.
I'm still not following. What are you saying there? The perceived evaluations. Whose perceived evaluations are you speaking of? Mr. Bogdanoff's?
The BCI report and Mr. Bogdanoff.
So,
in other words, their evaluations of what occurred and the information they collected, plus Mr. Bogdanoff's overlay of that information against his own opinions, which I simply incorporated instead of going officer by officer because I only had one that I was going to comment on in terms of excessive force.
So you say you totally concur, right? I totally concur with the perceived evaluations as related.
With the officers accepting Officer Brelo. I say that.
You just said that by that language you were referring to the investigators from BCI and Mr. Bogdanoff's evaluation.
Yes, but I've already said with the accepting of the Officer Brelo's. It may be not your artful way of saying it, sir, but it's my way of saying it.
I've never been accused of that, being artful.
Well, in any event, I think I say it pretty clearly, accepting what Officer Brelo said. I mean, accepting Officer Brelo's conduct. I think it's pretty clear that no matter how you look at it, if you look at Mr. Bogdanov's report and mine, I think there is a slight difference of accepting for, and I put that in there. I just didn't come straight out and say I disagree with him on that one point. I just said accepting for Officer Brelo's conduct.
Anything else you want to add?
No, I'm just explaining why I have indicated it the way I have.
Okay. Your opinion number 7 continues. My evaluation of this case is based upon being a tactical instructor to police officers, a firearm instructor, a pursuit instructor, your own street experience, and having evaluated hundreds of officer-involved shootings throughout the U.S.
Yes.
And then you continue on with your experience at these seminars that you made reference to, and then the last sentence in that paragraph opinion is, each shooting, as I mentioned earlier, should be and was, as part of my assessment, evaluated one shot at a time, not as 139 shots, correct?
Yes.
Paragraph 8 is your opinion number 8. I found, and it is my opinion, that but for one officer's involvement, Officer Brelo's, the other 12 officers' decision to shoot and apply deadly force was objectively reasonable, correct?
Yes.
This assessment is based upon what the officers knew or were told by other officers that comported with what their own observations were, confirming by the actions of the driver and or passenger, as well as a series of loud bangs, correct?
Yes.
The only evaluation is that of an officer's reasonably perceived threat by a suspect. And did the officer have probable cause to believe that the threat was one that posed either a perceived threat of death or great bodily injury to him, herself, or another? I believe this level of perceived threat is what each of these officers faced and evaluated. Even Officer Brelo, in my opinion, would have initially reasonably perceived a deadly threat of death or serious bodily injury when he utilized ambush training and fired through his windshield as he believed he was about to be rammed. And then, in the split second he had for evaluation, believed the driver was pointing a dark object of him. So that takes us to the top of page 10, correct?
Yes.
So, again, going back, although you point out that you have issues as it relates to Officer Brelo, would you agree that there is no analysis of the use of deadly force in this case in specific terms?
I think I gave an overview of the use of deadly force, and I was only justifying it. Since I justified the use of deadly force to this point, I didn't see the necessity in restating what each of the officers did. I believe that if you indicate that the officers acted reasonably, rather than going shot by shot and saying why it was reasonable, is not necessary if my overall opinion is simply that they acted reasonably. I didn't see the need in wasting the time to try to justify each of them if that is my opinion.
Because that's what Mr. Bogdanov was doing, and you were adopting and incorporating his report. That's why you didn't go through it individually.
No, I did it myself, but I simply, since he was submitting a report that had it all laid out, I simply said, and I incorporate his report. That's correct.
So you used general terms, correct, on page 9?
Yes.
And there's no specific individual analysis, correct?
That's correct.
All right. So now we're on page 10, and at the bottom of page 9 and to the top of page 10 where we left off, you were indicating in your report that even Officer Brelo initially reasonably perceived a deadly threat of death or serious bodily injury when he shot through his windshield, correct?
I think he could, yes.
As he believed he was about to be rammed, correct?
Yes.
And you characterized the amount of time he had as a split second, correct?
Yes, the car was coming at him. He had to make a decision. He made that decision.
You don't mention anything there about putting the car in reverse or doing
No, I
something
didn't.
else, do you?
No, I was asked a question. I said there are options, and that's one of them.
Okay, so now your report continues. Even when shooting as he exited his patrol vehicle and sought cover behind another zone car, it was reasonable.
That's correct. That's right.
So that other zone car was what car?
238.
238? The actions taken after this point by Officer Brelo were not reasonable, and he violated police tactical procedures of staying behind cover, evaluating the action, and begin giving verbal commands. correct?
Correct.
Instead, it appears that Brelo jumped up onto the suspect vehicle's hood and began firing into the vehicle numerous times. Is that what your report indicates?
That's what it says, yes.
Okay. There's no mention of Brelo being on the trunk of 238 from the time he gets behind 238 taking cover.
No, I didn't mention that. I went, he was up on the vehicle. I thought the facts were pretty well laid out already that he did.
Where are the facts laid out that Brelo was on the trunk of 238?
Not in my report. I didn't put it in there because it indeed was part of the factual information that I had reviewed. I went straight to the fact that he then is on the hood of the car firing directly into the window.
Because that's the use of force that you called into question, right?
Yes.
The deadly force used on the hood of the Malibu, right?
Yes.
And you were not questioning the deadly force used while in the trunk of 238.
Getting up was not proper, but utilizing the deadly force as he did from the position of the hood was a excessive use of force.
Where do you say that in your report?
I said that that was not reasonable.
Where do you say that when he was on the trunk of 238?
I didn't.
You didn't say that.
No.
But because you did, may I ask you something? Assuming there is some evidence that the defendant got up on the trunk of 238 and shot from there, either leaning over the light bar or not, if that did occur, your opinion is that even that was still reasonable under the circumstances?
Unreasonable.
Unreasonable.
I said everything I mentioned in here, that everything after he was behind the vehicle, and I guess I broad brushed the subject and indicated that everything afterward was unreasonable. That's getting onto the trunk, getting onto the top of the car. I went specifically to the application of the force from the hood of the vehicle. But I said already, everything after being behind the vehicle was unreasonable.
Okay. Pardon my interruption.
When Officer Brelo was firing from the trunk of 238, was there other gunfire from other officers taking place?
He said there was.
I'm asking you, what's your opinion? You've read everything you say. You've looked at the videos.
He said there
were other officers shooting?
Well, hold on. Maybe the question is this: what facts are you taking as true to render your opinion? Do you, in making your opinion, find that he was not the only one firing at the time he was behind 238 on the ground?
That's correct. There were other officers from the right and the left that were still applying force.
Still using deadly force.
Right.
So the fact that they had their feet on the ground made theirs lawful, and the fact that he had his feet on a trunk made his inappropriate.
Violation of training, as I've already talked about, in terms of going up and putting himself in a vulnerable position and utilizing that deadly force that he did specifically from the hood of the vehicle, because the vehicle had already been contained. They had been neutralized at that time.
130-some shots were being fired, right?
That's correct.
And officers gave statements that bullets were flying by their head, right?
Some said something similar to that.
And it's your testimony that officers involved in those circumstances would know what's going on behind them and would be paying attention to what's going on behind them.
Not under all.
Rather than where the gunfire is coming from.
Not under all circumstances, no.
These police units had pursued the Malibu for well over 20 minutes before they got to this location. Correct?
That's correct.
And they were operating with emergency lights and sirens operating, correct?
Correct.
And all these police units here had their emergency lights on and sirens in operation while the shooting was coming down.
They may have. Yes, there was some. There certainly. I didn't know if they all did. You said all. There certainly were some sirens, and certainly lights were on. Yes.
Your best guess, or if you have specific information, tell us which one or more than one didn't have the lights on and didn't have the siren on.
I don't know which ones did or did not.
And what impact does that have on officer perception?
Well, certainly there's a lot of noise going on. Certainly there's a lot of light. Some of it's flashing.
Yeah, what about the strobe effect of those lights? What impact does that have on an officer in a deadly force shootout like that?
It could have some blinding effect, depending on where they are.
Well, what effect does it have on anyone being able to hear, show me your hands?
When you're just a few feet away, I don't believe it makes a difference. I had talked about that earlier. I commented that when I was asked a question, that being that he was about 6 feet away from them, window was partially rolled down, I believe that that does have an effect.
So you're telling us here today with a straight face that given all these facts, that it would be proper police tactics at that point while gunfire is occurring for officers to be yelling out to the suspects in the Malibu who they think are shooting at them to show me your hands.
Objection, Your
That's
Honor.
what an officer
I'm going to
Objection is good enough.
No, it
It's
isn't.
cross-examination. Overruled.
Not when he disrespects him all the time, Judge.
No,
I mean, all these five comments for him are just getting ridiculous.
That's, like I said,
And this
that
is-
is a matter of personal preference. If he thinks that's effective, he thinks it's effective. This witness is perfectly capable of handling a little implied or direct insult or derogatory comment. Please, it's cross-exam. How are you going to handle the defense witnesses? With kid gloves? I mean, please, it's a trial.
Want to respond to that, Judge?
I guess it's rhetorical. I'll see in a couple of days.
What? How did you respond to Cibolic when
No.
he was up there?
Please,
Cross-examined.
please. This doesn't.
I'm sorry, Ron.
This doesn't advance your case, just as the speaking objections don't necessarily advance the plaintiff's case. Can we focus on the evidence? So, sir, if there's a question pending for you, I certainly forget what it is, so if you can either restate it or rephrase it, Mr. D'Angelo.
So it's your testimony that officers who are facing gunfire from what they reasonably believe to be the suspects in this Malibu, after having chased them for over 20 minutes with 60-some police cars with lights and sirens on, as they were out there and bullets were flying past them, they should have been yelling, "Show me your hands.
I think
Stop
they...
shooting at us."
Sir, we train civilian law enforcement officers to make every effort to get compliance. One way you get compliance is not only by shooting, because shooting is a last resort. If you can get compliance and get them to stop by realizing they now are surrounded, they're contained, that's exactly what they should do. This is not a situation where we're at war. We're not simply rushing the machine gun nest and putting our own life at risk and to take out them at any cost. We are civilian law enforcement officers, and we give our level best at getting those individuals to comply. They had already run their car into the side of the patrol car. It wasn't going anywhere. Officer Brelo's assertion that it was still moving this whole time, the car would have been down the road and gone if he was correct of that perception. It was not moving. It had come to rest, and they were contained. There were cars behind. There were cars in front. There were officers that were shooting. Officer Brelo, sir, is the one that I'm commenting on. Just Officer Brelo. Sir, I'm speaking. Officer Brelo is the one that I said should be giving those commands because he's the one that put himself in that position to be very close to be able to yell at them. And I thought that at that time, that is the action that he should be taking as a civilian law enforcement officer. Get them to stop so that we don't continue shooting. It's not about a game of continuing and shooting until all of them are taken out without our best effort of stopping it.
Okay, did Officer Sistek put himself in a position when he got out of 238 and this Malibu was coming at him and almost ran him over?
The Malibu couldn't have almost run over him because his car stopped behind. He said it was continuing to move. But if you've read the information, if you listened to the video, if you watched and evaluated carefully what he said, it's bizarre. It doesn't make sense. And bizarre is not objectively reasonable.
Hold on. It is true. He was asking, was Officer Sistek in a position of, in a position when he got
Oh,
out?
Sistek. I thought you were talking about Officer Brelo. I'm not talking about Officer Sistek,
Well,
sir.
I asked you the question. So my question to you, based on your speech about Officer Brelo, did you believe, and is it your opinion, that Officer Sistek put himself in a bad position when he got out of the zone car, 238, and the Malibu just happened to be coming by him?
It is, again, generally recognized in law enforcement, sir, that it's not a good place to be inside of your car. If you can get out and not stay there flat-footed inside your patrol car to be hit or shot at, it's better. That's why they had the ambush training. Seeing the car coming towards his vehicle, he took an opportunity. I don't have a problem with taking that opportunity to extricate himself quickly. Was that car presenting deadly force? You asked me that already. I already confirmed that it was.
I'm talking about Officer Sistek, are you?
I'm talking about the officer that was in 238.
Okay. And do you remember that officer's name?
I don't recall the names of every officer.
Well, that's Officer Sistek.
Okay. I thought it was, but I don't recall every one of them. I was referring to the officer that got out of his car. I made that pretty clear.
Okay. Well, you recall that he said in the statement that he was almost run over. He got
Yes.
out, he was startled, and that's why he fired at the suspect vehicle.
And I say, so what? What is the issue, sir? I said that the car was imposing deadly force, and I just got through indicating to you.
Hold on, he's about to tell you what he thinks, so what is, so I guess that's going to be his next
All right.
question.
So was it Officer Sistek's fault that when he got out of the car that this Malibu was bearing down on him? Was that Officer Sistek's fault?
Of course not.
Okay. So when he got out of his car and fired at the occupants of the Malibu, he was acting appropriately and reasonably, correct?
I don't know why you keep asking me about all the others, because I've already said my evaluation was they did act
Would
appropriately.
you direct the witness
Well,
to answer the question?
this is a fair question, so you either do or don't think.
I thought he did,
Okay.
Your Honor. I thought so.
And he got to behind the zone car there, 238, didn't he?
Yes.
Sistek did? And he continued to fire at the Malibu, correct?
Yes.
And officers from 3rd District Vice, O'Donnell and Eareg and Demchek, also were firing at the occupants in the Malibu, right?
Yes.
And so while these officers are firing, you're not taking any issue with their tactical positions and blaming them for basically using deadly force, right?
Correct.
And so when Brelo gets out of his car, you strike that. When Brelo comes into the driveway, is it his fault that the Malibu is now coming at him? Officer Brelo.
Officer Brelo said that when he put his car in park, that suspect car had already hit 238.
Right. And how far was Officer Brelo's front end to the front end of the Malibu?
Half a car length, probably.
Half a car length?
Something like that.
If I told you 1 foot and 2 inches, would that...
It didn't appear to me, it didn't appear to my perception to have been 1 foot and 2 inches.
Okay. Would you agree that when Officer Brelo pulled his vehicle into the driveway and gunfire was already erupting, that he was surprised to see this car coming at him?
I think he saw the car coming prior to that. And I think his statement was such that he did.
Okay. Do you think, because I don't think you want to acknowledge that Brelo was surprised, if Cindy Moore, his partner, were driving, do you believe that she or any other officer driving 217 would have been startled to see the suspect vehicle coming at them?
I don't know how to characterize whether somebody's surprised or startled. The car was coming that direction.
Was it the officer's fault who was driving 217? Was it the officer's fault that the Malibu was now coming at them?
No.
Okay. When Brelo got out of the car,
Yes.
he continued to fire shots.
He
correct?
did.
And he was lawful in his use of deadly force there, correct?
Correct. That mistaken but lawful, yes.
Mistaken, so it was okay for Sistek at that point? He wasn't mistaken?
Yes.
So, Sistek
Well,
was
hold
not
on,
mistaken, but
because I
Brelo
don't
was.
understand your answer. Sistek, as you know, is apparently the one who jumped out of the passenger
238.
side of 238 and fired and went to the front.
Right.
You say at that point, Sistek, you believe, was or was not mistaken about the threat of deadly force to him?
Mistaken about the shooting, but not about the car coming at him. I thought we had already gotten over the fact that a car coming towards you in that manner is the application of deadly force.
When Brelo got out of the driver's side of 217, it's your testimony that he was mistaken in his belief that he was in danger of serious physical harm by this Malibu?
I didn't say that. We're talking about the car. I said mistaken belief about the shooting. Obviously, they're not mistaken about the car coming in that direction.
So the car, at this point, was a potential weapon against Officer Brelo and Officer Sisek?
Until it jammed up against 238.
Okay, and you're telling the court that it was jammed and could not move from that point. That's your expert opinion?
That's the way it appeared to me, yes.
Okay. All the while, when Brelo's behind 238, other shots are ringing out, correct?
There were, that's right.
This happened in 18 seconds, correct?
Yes.
Do you know any of the other officers that were yelling out verbal commands to the occupants of the Malibu when the shots were ringing out? Show me your hands, put the car in park, and don't try to run us over?
There was some testimony that those comments were heard. By who, I don't know.
It's your testimony that officers were saying, show me your hands?
That's what Officer Moore said.
Okay.
She said that she believed she heard that. I believe Officer O'Donnell, may have said that as well.
Okay. Anyone else besides those two officers?
I don't recall anyone else saying it, no.
Would you agree that you have not attached or made specific reference to any policy, procedures, rule violations, training sessions that were violated by Officer Brelo in your report?
Not by specific policies, no. I talked about generally recognized training for police officers.
And in your direct testimony, you have not made specific reference to any IACP model provision that was violated. You have not made any specific reference to any training that was given Officer Brelo in this particular case that he violated, correct?
I did not.
All right. You've just spoken in general terms, correct?
Generally recognized police practices and training.
None of which are attached to your reports specifically.
That's correct.
You make reference on page 10 of your report to the number of shots that Officer Brelo fired, correct? It's right in the middle.
I believe so.
And you indicate in the next sentence, but as I already related, it is not the number of shots fired, but the reasonable perception of the officer at the time deadly force is used, correct?
Yes.
Your next sentence is, Brelo came from behind cover after all the shooting had ceased, and according to what he related to Brian Sobolik, he confirmed it was him, Brelo, who jumped on the hood of the vehicle and pumped rounds through the windshield at Russell and or Williams, correct?
Yes.
Now, your report's dated September 25th, 2013, correct?
Yes.
The state obtained an audio expert report in May of 2014, so obviously you did not have that when you prepared your report, correct?
No.
So there's been testimony in this case that there was a final series of shots that totaled 18 specific gunshots. And 15 of them are opined to be from Officer Brelo, but there are 3 separate and distinct gunshots. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if there are 3 separate gunshots, that would mean that either 1, 2, or 3 other officers were still firing in that last series of shots besides Officer Brelo, correct?
Well, I'll have to let the audio experts talk about that because I think they were inconclusive that that wasn't something that was a retort from perhaps bouncing off of the environment.
Right. But if officers perceive that there was additional gunfire, would that be a reasonable mistaken belief, that they're hearing more gunfire?
Well, they were hearing Officer Brelo's 15 rounds and nobody else was shooting.
Oh, you know that for a fact?
Other than those 3 potential shots, that's correct.
Okay. Well, if you allow that those 3 potential shots were real shots and came from other officers, that would mean that the threat was not over in the eyes of 1, 2, or 3 other officers besides Brelo, correct?
The ceasefire had already been called.
Well, ceasefire let's talk about action and reaction. When someone yells out ceasefire, it takes time for the officer to perceive that it's time to stop shooting, correct?
There's been some research that indicates a split second that it takes that may not be exactly on the call for ceasefire. It may take a 10th of a second or a 25th of a second.
And ceasefire in the context of the gunshots going on, the sirens going, and the red lights flashing, correct?
Ceasefire came before Officer Brelo jumped onto the hood.
Oh, and you know that for a fact?
That's what appears that it came from Sergeant Coleman.
Well, do you have Sergeant Coleman's statement?
Not with me.
Okay, so you're just throwing that out. You don't know for a fact that she said that.
That was my
time.
perception.
That was your perception. It could be a mistaken perception, couldn't it?
At this point, that's what I believe that it was, that she had indicated it, I think, twice. Yes, sir.
Do you say that in your report?
No.
Okay. Do you say that there was a ceasefire order and Brelo continued shooting?
No.
Are you aware that Officer Sobolik was re-interviewed in October of 2014?
I believe that there was, yes.
And are you aware of the fact that he testified in this case?
I would assume that he did. I didn't know.
Did the state give you a copy of his police report relative to answering questions about his actions and shooting on the night in question, November 29, 2012?
I only have the statements that were given.
Okay. May I approach, Your Honor?
Sure.
Showing you Defendant's Exhibit I. I'd ask you to look at that, and my question is, has the state given you a copy of that police report?
Objection, Your Honor, it's not a police report.
I don't know whether to sustain that or not because I don't know what it is, but let's just call it a report, I guess, or statement.
I don't recall it.
What's the date of it? Post 9/25/13?
November 30th.
Yes.
Of what year?
2014?
Yes.
Did he have time to read it, Your Honor? If he
Sure.
Well,
Sure.
he may or may not ask questions. I don't know.
I do.
The first question was, have you been given a copy of that? And the answer is...
I don't recall.
Okay. Now, are you going to ask him to
Let me,
some contents?
No. I'll follow up, sir.
Oh, okay. Thought you wanted me.
I would
Okay.
object.
Well, hold on.
Line of questioning.
It's fair to ask what was reviewed, but here,
Yes,
the objection's overruled, and let's hear the next question. It sounds like it may or may not be on this report anyway.
Are you aware of the fact that Officer Sobolik has testified, and he stated so in his written report that I just presented to you?
Objection.
That after he fired,
Go ahead.
that after he fired 2 more shots by 238, and after he had seen an officer standing on the hood of the Malibu, that he came back behind 238 to get a tactical position to continue firing.
He did not.
Hold on. First of all, the only question is, are you aware that he said this somewhere? That question in of itself is not objectionable, so the objection's overruled, and your answer is?
I would have to take a look at his statement that I was given to know whether he said that at that time or not. I don't recall his exact movements.
Okay.
Well, let's suffice to say then, if he said that in the pre-September 25, 2013 statement you were given, then it's something you knew, although you may have forgotten it between then and now.
I have it with me. I can look at it.
Right. If he didn't say that, you haven't seen any of his written or oral testimony or report since then, so you wouldn't know. Or is that right?
That's correct.
Your Honor, may he look, may this witness, he was given thousands of pages to review. May he look to see?
Well, it may all be moot. What is the what's the ultimate question going to be? That if such and such is true, was it reasonable?
No, if I may ask, Your Honor, if it's true that Officer Sobolik testified in court and indicated in his statement dated November the 30th, 2014. In answer to the following question.
Objection, Your Honor.
If you saw someone on top of a car, what did it cause you to do? Answer. I stopped shooting because I no longer had a clear shot to the threat. I then moved from cover behind the engine block of Zone Car 232 to the rear of Zone Car 238 so I would have a clear shot. If he testified to that and said so in his statement, would that indicate to you that he perceived that there was an ongoing threat because he was trying to get another shot off?
Objection.
All right, that is a fair question. It's a bit long-winded, but the substance of it is fair. Overruled.
It indicates that he was preparing to do what might be necessary under the circumstances if it occurred, although he never shot.
Because the threat wasn't over, that's why he tried to get in a tactical position.
I believe he also testified that it was a call for ceasefire. He also said that everybody had stopped moving inside the vehicle at that time.
Do you expect you have much more?
Yes, Your Honor.
Well, here's what we're going to do then. We're going to take a break, so sir, you remain under oath. We'll see you in about 15 minutes.
Thank you.
While we remain on the record, this witness is going to go, let's say, at least until 4 with redirect and so on. I would say, whoever's responsible for this, don't worry about having anybody else available this afternoon.
We've got one, if it's okay, Your Honor.
She's not available for the next 2
And
days.
we don't know what
The name of this other person is?
relative of the this is social worker.
She's going to speak on behalf of Malissa Williams. So it
Is this a
shouldn't be long.
10-minute affair?
I'm sorry?
Is this a 10-minute affair?
Yes, it shouldn't be long at all.
What about, I know you're in your cross right now, but what about after this break doing the social worker, you say?
Yes.
Oh, we don't want to keep the expert overnight for the very variety of reasons.
Judge, I don't think my redirect's going to be that long.
Well, let's see how it goes, but I may not have time to take, her name is?
Her name is Kathleen.
We'll figure it out, Judge, if you can.
Kathleen, so thank you, rough record. Let's say 35 after, if you would. Thank you, gentlemen and ladies.